The fog of London clung to the streets like a wet shawl that evening, muffling the usual bustle of Fleet Street. Somewhere beyond the mist, a constable's whistle pierced the gloom, a sharp cry of trouble. But it wasn't until the next morning that Dr. John Watson, was properly introduced to the grim affair. The death of Harold Venn, the city's most exclusive tailor, discovered lifeless inside his workshop, doors bolted from within, windows latched tight, and not a single footprint. In or out on the rain-drenched cobblestones, Lestrade had summoned Holmes early. The inspector, though often resistant to my friend's methods, knew this case had too much devilry for Scotland Yard to handle alone. Venn's body had been found by his apprentice, a young man named Ellis Brand, who had arrived promptly at 7 for the day's work. What he saw through the frosted workshop window prompted him to break in through the rear alley, where he found the master tailor slumped over his cutting table, a fine silver shears driven into the base of his neck. Holmes and I arrived by cab just after 9. The scene was peculiar from the outset. No sign of forced entry, no blood trails beyond the body, and most bizarre of all, a spool of red silk thread stretched taut from the body to the far end of the workshop, disappearing under a cabinet, as though drawn deliberately through the air. Holmes stooped low to examine the thread, his eyes narrow. With purpose. Do you notice, Watson, the tension here? This thread isn't hanging loose. It's fixed. He reached beneath the cabinet and retrieved a brass button pinned to the floor. With a tailor's tack, the thread tied carefully to it. Why would a dying man or his killer set such a thing? No message, no symbol, simply a line drawn across a room. Lestrade huffed beside us, ritualistic, perhaps. Or maybe the killer was disturbed mid-act. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he examined the body closely. The shears are clean. No fingerprints, but that's expected. Note the position of the wound, precise, surgical, no defensive injuries. Venn knew his attacker, or he was taken completely by surprise. Ellis Brand, the apprentice, waited nervously in the hallway. Holmes questioned him briskly. When did you last see Mr. Venn alive? Last night, sir. We finished late, around 8:30. He told me to go straight home. Said he had a private commission to finish alone. Did he mention the client? No, sir. But I overheard a man's voice before I left. Deep, foreign sounding, maybe Eastern European. I didn't see him. Holmes scribbled a note, eyes already drifting. And you are certain the doors were locked this morning? Every bolt? Sir, I had to pry the back window open to get in, and even that was latched from the inside. As Brand left, Holmes turned to Lestrade. Let us take stock. A man is killed in a locked room. No sign of entry or exit. An odd thread connects the victim to a random point on the floor. The weapon belongs to the victim. No signs of struggle. A mysterious visitor the night before. And yet, something here feels staged. We visited Venn's home that afternoon, a modest flat above a milliner's shop. His wife, Lydia, seemed dazed, her grief genuine, but tinged with something else, anxiety, perhaps. Holmes noticed it too. Her eyes darted to a writing desk in the corner more than once. When Holmes asked if Harold had enemies, she hesitated. Not enemies, no. But he had clients who could be particular, powerful men, politicians, ambassadors. They came at odd hours, always secret fittings. He never spoke of them. Back on Baker Street, Holmes reviewed the notes with manic energy. The thread, Watson. It isn't a symbol. It's a pointer. Imagine standing here where the killer was and drawing a line to where the shears would be thrown or placed. It's not about where the body is. It's about controlling what we see when we arrive. I frowned. So the killer staged the thread to mislead us, or to prove something. Holmes murmured. An alibi, perhaps. The next morning brought another twist. Lestrade reported that a witness had come forward, a cabby named Riggs. He'd driven a tall man in a wool coat to Ven's shop around 10 p.m. the night of the murder. The fare had refused to give a name, but paid double the rate. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And now we have our phantom client. If only we had a face to match. Riggs was brought in, but could offer little. He wore a scarf up to his nose. Sir, but he had a limp, dragged his left foot. Holmes sprang to his feet. That's it, the limp. Explain. I urged. The floor, Holmes said. Ven's workshop was immaculate, and yet the dust pattern showed one disturbance by the cabinet near where the thread ends. A man with a limp would naturally shift balance, dragging his foot, catching on the thread if it were already stretched. But there was no sign of that, meaning the thread was placed after the murder. I finished. Holmes grinned. Precisely, which means the killer lingered, perhaps even to fabricate his innocence, and so back we went to the workshop. Holmes examined the cabinet again and found what he suspected, a scrap of fabric fine. Wool, claret in color. Holmes pocketed it and turned to Lestrade. We need a list of clients with limps and claret coats. And quickly. By evening, Lestrade had the answer. Victor Radic, a Romanian diplomat, known for his cane and fiery temper, had recently been fitted by Ven. But he had an alibi at a gala across town the night of the murder, witnessed by dozens. Holmes narrowed his gaze. To clean, a man of secrets wouldn't dare appear near the scene. But what if he hired someone to impersonate him? Someone with a limp, someone who knew tailoring. My mind caught up. Ellis Brand. Holmes nodded grimly. He lied. He wasn't just an apprentice, he's an understudy, a mimic. He could reproduce a coat, a limp, even a voice. He wasn't early to work. He never left. But Holmes wasn't done yet. The thread, Watson, it wasn't an alibi. It was a signature, a tailor's mark, sewn truth, as they say. He mocked us as we confronted Brand that night. The young man crumbled. He was going to sell me out, he whispered. Radic wanted silence, then wanted coin. I chose to survive. Holmes only sighed. You chose to sow your own trap, Mr. Brand. And thus ended the case of the tailor who sowed his own alibi. The confession might have sealed it for Lestrade, who was quick to scribble into his notepad and summon to constables. But Holmes, who had leaned against the wall with arms folded, unmoved, remained silent, not in satisfaction, but in the sharp stillness that meant his mind was elsewhere entirely. Curious. He muttered, more to himself than any of us, to convenient. Brand, trembling under the gaslight's harsh glow in the workshop's rear chamber, gave no resistance as the constables cuffed him. He gave me the coat. He insisted. Radic, and money. I told you. I didn't plan it. I was used. Lestrade cut in. Used or not, you killed a man. But where's the money? Holmes asked flatly, still not looking at Brand. Surely, Radic didn't pay you in the abstract. Where is the bribe? Brand blinked. He paid in gold. I buried it, out near the river. Then we'll dig, Lestrade said, but Holmes raised a hand. No, you won't find it there. He turned slowly, stepping closer to the cutting table where Venn had been killed. The blood had dried to a dark crust along the wood grain. Tell me, Ellis, Holmes said softly, if you had planned a murder this meticulously locked doors, staged thread, borrowed coat, would you leave the gold here, at the scene? No, Brand said, blinking fast. Of course not. And yet, Holmes murmured, reaching down behind the cabinet, where he retrieved a small black pouch lined in satin. Here it is. Lestrade stiffened. What, how did you? Exactly. Where I found the fabric swatch, Holmes said. Only I didn't retrieve the pouch earlier, because it wasn't there until this afternoon. He placed it on the table and unfastened the tie. Inside, a neat stack of sovereigns, each gleaming, unnaturally clean. Not the dull patina of coins buried in earth, but the polished gleam of something prepared for display. I suggest, Holmes continued, turning back to Brand, that you didn't kill Venn at all. Ellis looked up, stunned. What? Oh, you lied about the voice, the client, the limp. You tampered with the thread and perhaps even staged the break-in. But you're no killer. Your fear tonight is genuine. You're being framed, not for coin, but for silence. But who? Holmes turned to Lestrade. Release him. Watch him. But release him. The real killer wanted Ellis out of the way conveniently. Guilty. Quietly removed. This gold is a plant, not a payment. And the person who placed it here today had access, familiarity, and, above all, urgency. Lestrade narrowed his eyes. Venn's wife, Mrs. Venn. Holmes began gently. Did you ever see this? He produced the pouch. She nodded, slowly. It was Harold's. He kept small things in it. Threads. Old cufflinks. Why? Do you recognize the coins inside? She looked and paused, frowning. No, these are not his. He didn't keep money here. Holmes closed the pouch. Then someone used it to mislead. He moved toward the writing desk in the corner of the room, the one she'd eyed nervously before. I wondered, Lydia, why you were afraid, not just grieving afraid. She stiffened. I believe your husband was involved in blackmail. Holmes continued, opening the desk drawers one by one. Tailors are privy to secrets, hidden wounds, concealed marks, tattoos best not seen. And yet, he never kept notes. Nothing written, no ledgers, except a Holmes stopped. He had found a false bottom in the lowest drawer, sliding it free with practiced ease. Inside were four envelopes, all sealed with red wax and marked in. A spidery hand. He opened one and removed a single photograph. Lestrade, summoned quickly, whistled low when he arrived. "That's Lord Kenley, isn't it?" "Indeed," Holmes said, "in the embrace of a man who is very much not his wife." Each envelope contained a similar secret, scandalous, damning, and carefully preserved. Holmes turned to Lydia. "Did you know?" She nodded, slowly. "Not at first. But Harold began taking late commissions. At odd hours, he started receiving letters in foreign tongues. I found one once signed with a red triangle." Holmes looked at Lestrade. "A Balkan intelligence group. That's no tailor's mark." "But what does this mean?" I asked. "Why kill then?" Holmes was pacing now. "Because he tried to sell something to valuable. Radicor, whoever, represents that triangle, wanted the letters, then tried to leverage them. He got greedy. He stopped. We must visit Radic now, before he flees." The Romanian diplomat resided in a manor near Belgravia, surrounded by wrought iron and silence. The butler who answered the door attempted to turn us away, but Holmes pressed forward, brushing past with authority that made even Lestrade blink. Radic, tall and imposing, stood at the hearth, a cane beside him and a glass of brandy in hand. "Gentlemen, you come uninvited." Holmes offered no greeting. "You had then killed because he refused to sell. Or worse, he tried to leak the photographs." Radic raised an eyebrow. "Photographs, we found them," Holmes replied. "And the coin pouch you so conveniently planted." Radic smiled. "I am a diplomat. I know nothing of your tailor or his finances. But you know Ellis Brand." Holmes countered. "You approached him 2 weeks ago in secret, promised him advancement, then left him holding the noose." Radic took a slow sip, but I saw it then, the twitch in his lip, the microsecond of hesitation. Holmes saw it too. "You used your influence to stall the investigation," Holmes said. "But your mistake was returning to the scene. The pouch, Radic. You left a fingerprint right here." He held up a coin with a thin smudge near the edge of a thumb, with a half-moon scar. Radic's hand twitched, moving subtly, to his cane. Holmes noticed. "I wouldn't. The yard has men outside." It was over. Radic didn't resist. As Lestrade took him in, Holmes turned back to me, his eyes still sharp. "There's always a thread, Watson, a single, strange thread. And once you follow it far enough, it leads to the tailor," I said, "or the man who sewed his guilt into another's sleeve." The cold night air hadn't yet lifted from Baker Street the following morning, when Holmes called me from the window, where he stood silhouetted against the grey. His mood had shifted, not triumphant, as one might expect after Radic's rest, but taut with something unresolved. His violin, untouched, lay silent beside his chair. "We have caught a man," he said, not turning from the glass, "but not the man." Radic did not wield the shears, but he orchestrated it, I said. "Surely that suffices." Holmes turned. "Does it? He used Ellis Brand, manipulated the evidence, but Harold then let someone in that workshop voluntarily. No struggle, no hesitation. He trusted the person who killed him. The Yard, meanwhile, pressed forward with the case. Lestrade, though proud of Radic's arrest, returned that afternoon with a furrowed brow. Radek claims diplomatic immunity. They're already pulling strings in surmise. Holmes didn't react. Then we must pull another string. He sent word to Lydia then, asking her to return to the workshop. She arrived shortly after 4, gloved and pale, but composed. Her eyes flitted around the space, settling briefly on the blood-stained table as though expecting her husband's ghost to rise from it. "You said Harold was involved in blackmail," she said softly. "What will become of his reputation? Less than what will become of yours." Holmes said gently, "If you continue to conceal what you know." She blinked at him, startled. "You lied about the pouch." He said, "You've seen it before. It's not for cufflinks or thread. It's a gift pouch one Radek used exclusively. And the red triangle you found wasn't from Harold's letter. It was on yours." She hesitated, then sat. "He made me deliver messages, vague ones, to clients. I thought it was harmless a way to keep them returning, playing into their vanities. Then he told me to hand-deliver a note to Lord Kenley. No return address, no name." "What did the note say?" I asked. She paused. "Only a number and a time." Holmes leaned forward. "Then Harold was selling secrets and involving you." Lydia clenched her jaw. "He said we'd retire to Vienna, that he was gathering enough to leave England forever. And he never told you what the buyers wanted." "No." "A beat. But I recognized one." "Who?" She swallowed. "Colonel Altford." That name caught Holmes like a hook. He stood slowly, turned to the window. "Of course, military intelligence. Known. Associate of Radek during the Balkan negotiations, and a client of Ven's for years." "I thought he was a friend," Lydia whispered. "He came to dinner once. Brought Harold cigars." Holmes turned back. "Do you think Altford would protect Harold, or eliminate him, once his usefulness expired?" Lydia didn't answer, but the tears in her eyes spoke enough. Holmes dismissed her gently and requested a meeting with the colonel the same evening. To my surprise, Altford agreed, receiving us in his Kensington estate bookshelves lined with military memoirs and exotic artifacts from decades of campaigns. A large oil painting of the man in full dress uniform dominated the drawing room. He was every inch the soldier, erect, iron-voiced, and painfully polite. A tragedy, Mr. Holmes. Venn was a true artist. I wore his work in Cairo, Delhi, even Constantinople. "Did you wear it to secret meetings, Colonel?" Holmes asked without a blink. Altford arched a brow. "I beg your pardon. Radek is in custody. Venn is dead. The chain is broken, but not cleanly. Too many versions of events. Too many. People telling us what they think we want to hear." Altford offered a half-smile. "What version of events do you want, Holmes? The one where you stop pretending?" Holmes said coolly, "You received letters, confidential ones. You paid to keep them quiet." Altford's expression didn't flicker. "If that were true, I wouldn't confirm it. But since you seem intent on dragging skeletons into the street, let me offer a piece of clarity." He stood and walked slowly to the fireplace, gazing into the coals. "I received no threats from Venn, but I did warn him, once, in private, to cease his games before he got burned. Burned by whom? By those who don't tolerate leverage. He looked over his shoulder. There are people far above me, Holmes, who would kill for far less than a bundle of photographs. Did you see Venn the night he died? No. Would you swear it? On my commission? But Holmes caught the flaw, subtle as it was. A tightening of the hand on the mantle. A shift in the stance guilt, not fear. I believe you visited him, Holmes said calmly. Perhaps not to kill, but to warn. And someone else watched you do it. Alfred turned fully now. Then you know more than I do. I left before 10. That detail snapped into place in Holmes's mind like a gear locking. He straightened. You left before 10. Yes, and the murder occurred sometime after that. That's what the coroner said. Indeed. Holmes bowed slightly. Thank you, Colonel. You've been most helpful. In the carriage ride home, I watched Holmes closely. You believe him? I believe he's proud, Holmes said. Too proud to soil his name with blood. But someone used his visit as a cover. Think. What's in the thread? The locked door. All designed not just to frame Ellis, but to hide the timing. You mean the killer came later? Holmes shook his head. No, the killer never left. The statement struck me cold. He continued. We assumed Venn was killed late. But that's because the apprentice found him in the morning. What if the murder happened before Alfred left, and the killer remained behind, hidden, long enough to make it appear otherwise? But who could stay hidden that long? Someone who belonged there. Someone with a key. Someone who knew the space so well that hiding in it posed no difficulty. The carriage jerked to a halt. We'd reached Baker Street, but Holmes was already moving. Coat swirling, face lit by a new fire. The final voice of deception. Watson. And it's time they were heard. It was just past 7 when Holmes and I arrived once more at the tailor's shop on Wellmore Street. A steady drizzle had begun, washing the gaslight reflections into puddles that shimmered like spilled mercury. The constable stationed outside gave a nod, and Holmes stepped through the door without breaking stride, eyes scanning the space like a man returning to a half-finished chessboard. Inside, silence hung heavy, as though the walls themselves held their breath. You believe the killer never left, I said, that they remained hidden in the shop, staging the scene after Venn was already dead. But who could do that? Holmes moved to the large armoire in the back, pulling it open. Bolts of fabric lined the interior, but it was the false backing he pressed that drew my attention. A hollow compartment, just large enough for a person to wait, motionless, for hours. The killer knew the layout, knew Ellis would find the body in the morning, knew Lestrade would follow the evidence at face value. Holmes turned to me. But they also knew something else, that Venn was planning to cut ties with everyone. The workshop still bore the faint smell of chalk dust and oil, of pressed wool and ash from the iron. Every detail felt suddenly like a cipher. Let's consider motives, Holmes murmured. Ellis Brand, ambition, resentment. He lied, yes, but more out of fear than malice. Then there's Raddick, driven by secrecy and self-preservation. Alfred, perhaps silenced by guilt. Lydia jealousy, protection, or self-preservation again. He turned slowly toward the staircase. But there is one more player. I followed him up to the flat above the shop, Ven's private quarters. Everything remained as it had, the tea left untouched on the side table, the empty whiskey glass beside a closed book. Holmes walked past these without pause and stopped before the bedroom door. Someone else had unrestricted access to Ven's life, his work, his flat, his schedule. Someone not questioned thoroughly because they were assumed to be irrelevant. He knocked once. The door creaked open to reveal a slender figure with ink-stained hands and thread clipped to the sleeves. Nathaniel Van Harold's nephew, barely 20, with soft eyes and the bearing of one raised in silence. He looked startled. "To see us, Mr. Holmes? I believe we've not spoken properly, Nathaniel. Might we come in?" The young man stepped aside, confusion lining his features. The room inside was cramped, neat. A small writing desk by the window, a sewing dummy in the corner, and several sketches pinned to a cork board, elegant designs, some bearing the name Ven and brand beneath the drawings. Holmes moved to them instantly. "You designed these?" Nathaniel gave a hesitant nod. "My uncle let me draft a few pieces. Ellis helped finish them, but they bear your name." "We had plans," Nathaniel said quietly. "My uncle was going to retire early, move abroad. He wanted me and Ellis to take over, not Lydia. No, she didn't like the shop. She barely came down after the war." Holmes turned. "So you stood to inherit everything business, reputation, legacy, but only if your uncle lived long enough to hand it to you." Nathaniel's jaw tensed. "What are you suggesting?" "That your uncle was unpredictable. He promised Ellis a future, then considered selling the shop outright to a foreign investor. He played too many sides, promised too much." Nathaniel's voice dropped. "He was going to sell it. He told me the week before he died, said he needed the money, that none of it mattered anymore." "And what did he offer you?" Nathaniel's lip curled in bitterness. "A position in Prague, sewing military uniforms. Said it was steady work." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You felt betrayed?" "I was betrayed." Holmes stepped forward. "And so you waited. That night, when Colonel Alford came and went, you were already here. You'd heard the arguments. You knew your uncle was out of time." Nathaniel's hands shook. "No. You were the only one who could have hidden inside that armoire. The only one with the time to tamper with the thread Ellis used the next morning. The only one who knew about the pouch and where Raddick left his tokens." Nathaniel backed away. "No one would believe me. He used me, promised me the shop, and gave it to traitors. But you planted the pouch," I said, to point at Raddick. Nathaniel's face twisted. "Raddick was using him. But Uncle didn't care. He said secrets were currency. He thought he could control them all. And so you cut him down." Holmes said coldly, "Not for patriotism, not for justice, but for fear that everything he built would vanish, that you'd be left with nothing." There was silence, long and brittle. Then Nathaniel's voice cracked. "He was going to erase me. I was the only one who loved this place." Footsteps thundered down below Lestrade, and his men arriving. Holmes didn't need to call for them. Nathaniel slumped in the chair, defeated before the door even opened. Later, as we stood outside beneath the gaslight, the rain had thinned to mist. Holmes lit a cigarette and stared into the street's haze. In the end, he said, it was neither politics nor conspiracy, just inheritance, a web of motives, I murmured, but all tangled by fear and vanity. Holmes added, a man who stitched his name into too many seams. Eventually, someone cuts the thread. He exhaled slowly. The glow of the cigarette flared once, then faded into the London night. The following morning brought with it a quiet, almost eerie finality. Headlines blared, Taylor's nephew confesses in deadly scandal, and Scotland Yard, not one to let triumph slip unnoticed, paraded Nathaniel's capture as the crown jewel of the season. Lestrade visited Baker Street by mid-morning, hat tipped back, and shoulders lifted in visible relief. You've done it again, Holmes, he said, easing into the chair opposite the fire. A clean confession, motive to spare, and all the political nastiness wrapped up with Raddick's expulsion. I'll wager this makes you miss the quiet days. Holmes didn't answer right away. He was at the sideboard, staring absently at the untouched breakfast, fingers lightly tapping the porcelain tray. You say it's clean, he murmured. I say it's convenient. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. You've got the motive, the shop, the betrayal, the tampering with the thread. It all fits, doesn't it? Holmes turned. It fits, but so does a borrowed coat. It may serve the moment, but wear it too long, and the seams begin to show. Lestrade made a face, but offered no retort. Holmes waited until he left before speaking. Again, Watson, when you examined the body, what did you note about the wounds? I thought back, deep, precise, a single thrust to the heart, no sign of a struggle. Why? Holmes paced slowly to his desk and opened a drawer. He drew out a folded sheet, the original coroner's report, and the angle of the wound, downward. I said, as though the killer stood over him. And that's just it, Holmes replied. Nathaniel is nearly a head shorter. Then, the report specifies a deep, direct wound angled from above, not something easily accomplished by someone his stature. Unless the victim was seated, perhaps Venn was seated. Then why was the blood spatter so high on the shelving? Behind him, Holmes tapped the edge of the paper. Even the coroner noted it. It indicated he stood. A standing victim, a downward thrust. Nathaniel would have needed a step stool. I frowned. What if not Nathaniel, someone taller, someone with a stronger hand? Someone whose name has never once come up in connection to betrayal, but has lingered near the edges of every alibi. He returned to the sideboard and lifted a small envelope, one we'd overlooked, delivered that morning by private courier. It bore no seal, only Holmes's name written in heavy, deliberate strokes. Inside was a single item, a white cufflink. Holmes turned it over in his palm. Venn had only one client who requested these custom. A man too careful to leave any fingerprints, but who took pride in subtle signals. I stepped closer. You mean this was planted? No, left, intentionally, to be found now, after the storm had passed. He moved swiftly to the shelf above the fireplace. and pulled down a small leather notebook, Ven's appointment ledger, recovered from the flat. Flipping to the final week, he pointed at an entry just before the night of the murder. Here, a final fitting. No client name, but the initials MB scrawled in the margin. Who is it? Holmes snapped the book shut. The man who now thinks himself untouchable. We rode at once to the Mayfair district, where old money mingled with new ambition, and knocked at the door of a tall white townhouse with blue shutters. A butler answered, curt and polished, but upon hearing Holmes's name, ushered us in without. The drawing room smelled faintly of brandy and old books, and sitting by the hearth was a man in his 40s, broad of shoulder, severe of jaw, and dressed with impeccable taste. He did not rise when we entered. Mr. Mortimer Bell, Holmes said calmly. Bell didn't smile. Mr. Holmes, how unfortunate for you to return after such a neat ending. Holmes held up the cufflink. You left this. I have many, Bell replied. One goes missing. I order another. But this one, Holmes said, is unique. Venn made these as a private commission. He requested them as a mark of exclusivity. No others exist. Bell leaned back. Then I suppose it proves I was his client. A detail I've never denied. You were more than a client. You were his banker, silent partner, and, in the end, his executioner. Bell said nothing. Holmes stepped forward. You saw it coming. Raddick's exposure, Lydia's breakdown, Nathaniel's growing suspicion. You were funding the shop as a front for laundering blackmail profits, weren't you? And when Venn decided to cash out, to run, you knew he would take your name with him. Bell's eyes didn't flinch, but a muscle in his jaw ticked. So, Holmes continued, you came to collect. You arrived after Alfred left. You were tall enough to strike from above, strong enough to do it cleanly, and cautious enough to wipe everything except the pouch, which you left near the thread for Nathaniel to find. Bell spoke finally, his voice low and measured. You have no proof. Holmes nodded. Not yet, but you made one mistake. He reached into his coat and drew out a strip of thin silk, torn and stained faintly with oil retrieved from the armoire's false panel during the night. A smear of blood traced the edge. This was caught on a nail inside the compartment. It doesn't match Nathaniel's tailoring. It matches yours. I took the liberty of examining your overcoat last year during the Havisham affair. Same silk, lining, same frayed stitching on the inner hem. Bell stared at the cloth, and for a brief moment, something behind his eyes shifted. Not panic, not rage. Calculation. You'll never make it stick, he said coolly. No. Holmes agreed. But I don't need to. Scotland Yard only needs motive, means, and enough to whisper the word conspiracy. Your accounts are already under scrutiny. Raddick's ledger points back to you. And now this. He flicked the silk gently onto Bell's lap. Bell didn't speak again. The butler reappeared as Holmes gestured toward the door. We stepped out into the fog-dampened street, silence lingering like breath on cold glass. You knew Nathaniel wasn't the end, I said. I hoped he wasn't, Holmes replied. But hope and deduction often part ways. This time, they met in the middle. I glanced back once to the closed door. Will he come after us? Not if he's wise, Holmes said. The clever ones rarely make the same mistake twice, and still. The quiet unease hung in the error sense that the final knot had not yet been tied, that somewhere behind the walls of polished rooms and expensive suits, the real threads were still being drawn. It was not until the next evening that Holmes returned to Baker Street, with an expression I hadn't seen since the Milverton affair, quiet, coiled with tension. He said nothing at first, merely unfastened his coat, placed a folded scrap of parchment on the desk, and poured himself a measure of whiskey. A letter, he said finally, gesturing toward it, delivered by private courier from a solicitor. In Southwark, Harold Venn's name is on the envelope, but the letter inside was addressed to someone else entirely, to me. I unfolded the parchment slowly. The handwriting was aged but deliberate. The ink faded. The opening line sent a strange chill through my chest. If anything happens to me, look to the past, not the future. Holmes sat across from me, elbows resting on his knees. It was written 7 years ago, Watson. 7. Left in trust with Venn's solicitor, only to be delivered upon his violent death. But why you? I asked. He didn't answer immediately, staring instead into the flames. Because he feared something I once said in jest, that a man may forget his enemies, but his enemies never forget him. He thought he was being hunted, and he wasn't wrong. The letter recounted a name neither of us had heard in many years. Edgar Vale, a forger Holmes had exposed during the Stonebridge bonds scandal. Venn, according to this note, had not only worked with Vale, but had been one of several co-conspirators laundering the profits through bespoke tailoring jobs, luxury garments, lined with concealed bond slips. When Vale was arrested, someone betrayed the rest. The ring collapsed. 3 men fled the country. 1, apparently, had remained. Mortimer Bell, I said aloud. He was the 4th. Holmes nodded slowly. Bell wasn't just laundering funds through the shop. He helped start the entire enterprise. That's why he killed Venn. It wasn't about the shop. It was about a secret buried too deep to survive daylight. But Venn's records didn't mention Bell's name in connection with the Stonebridge case. I argued they wouldn't. Holmes replied. Bell was the one who erased it. He reached for the coal tongs and fished something from the embers Venn's pocket notebook, now half-burned, retrieved quietly from the tailor's stove during the initial investigation. Holmes had noticed it then, but withheld it until now. Venn tried to burn this the night he died. Perhaps he feared he'd waited too long to run. Or perhaps he realized Bell had grown too bold. Flipping gently through the charred pages, he paused at a page where faint ink clung to the margin. A single name, smudged but legible. Vale. Holmes turned it toward me. There, proof that Venn was still haunted by the past, still in contact with that old world. I leaned forward. Then perhaps this wasn't a clean break at all. Perhaps Bell wasn't the only one still playing the game. Holmes didn't move. Exactly. That's what's been troubling me. He rose and crossed to the map. He kept pinned over the fireplace, a map of London, marked in dots and strings. Do you recall the address Raddick gave when we questioned him? "The flat near Fleet Street," I said. Holmes tapped a red pin near the location. "That building was registered to a shell company. That company was created in 1896, 2 years before the Stonebridge scandal, by a man named Edgar Vale. But Vale died in prison. Officially," Holmes said darkly, "but his body was never claimed, and the warden who signed off on his death died of a sudden heart attack within the month." He turned back to me. "What if Raddick wasn't simply using Venn? What if he was being used? If Vale or someone acting in his name was still pulling strings behind the scenes? But to what end?" Holmes was quiet, then murmured, "Revenge, control, or perhaps something far worse, resurrection of the old scheme." We spent the next morning following threads through the city. At Raddick's former residence, now emptied, Holmes found a hidden drawer behind the fireplace. Inside, a series of handwritten notes in a cipher we recognized from an old case, a variation of the cipher Vale used in Stonebridge. One note stood out. It read only, "The tailor stitched more than cloth. The vaults open soon." It wasn't until dusk that Holmes spoke again. "There's one place left to check." We arrived at the East End storage house. Venn had rented under an assumed name a place the police had overlooked, believing it no longer in use. Inside, by lantern light, we uncovered racks of uncut cloth, ledgers bound in oilskin, and beneath the floorboards, a chest marked MV Private. Inside were dozens of tiny slips of parchment stitched into the hems of bespoke jackets. Bonds, forged titles, bearer notes from the Stonebridge affair many thought destroyed. All intact. I stared in disbelief. He kept them all these years. Holmes said nothing, only lowered the lantern to inspect the false base of the chest. There, etched into the wood in a nearly invisible hand, was a symbol, a serpent coiled through a needle's eye. We had seen that symbol before. The insignia of the thread circle. Holmes whispered. A secret society of counterfeiters, long disbanded, or so we thought. We stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of it settling. Holmes's face had gone pale. This wasn't just about Venn or Bell. This was the last breath of something older, buried in soot and silence. They tried to resurrect it. Venn tried to sell it. Bell tried to kill it. And now? Holmes looked up slowly, eyes shadowed with something cold and calculating. Now someone else will come for it. And we're no longer dealing with murder, Watson. We're dealing with legacy, a criminal empire trying to rise again from its ashes. I didn't ask what came next. I could see it in Holmes's eyes. The past wasn't finished with us yet. Holmes remained at the East End storage house longer than necessary, staring into the hollowed-out chest as though it whispered answers only he could hear. When he finally turned to me, his features had sharpened with purpose. "Watson, we shall return to Baker Street," he said with brisk clarity. "But on our way, I must stop at St. Bartholomew's. I've a notion I wish to test." The carriage ride passed. Intense silence. At the hospital's quiet laboratory wing, Holmes requested access to the chemical lab and requested a small glass vial, distilled vinegar, and powdered iodine. I watched with muted confusion as he prepared a mixture and dipped a fabric scrap into the solution the very same from one of the suits found in the chest. Within seconds, the cloth-stained violet, starch, Watson. Not ordinary starch, but one laced with a unique binder used by only one cleaner in London Whitlock's on Brewer Street. I noticed the sheen on the cuffs during the examination. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless one knew precisely what to look for. The bond slips were meant to survive more than concealment. They were meant to endure laundering. I leaned closer. Then the suits were still being worn, not just worn. Holmes said quietly, circulated. That night, he sent telegrams under various aliases, requesting private fittings with several high society tailors and laundering firms across London. I need to stir the water, Watson. Something to agitate the fish. The following morning, a reply arrived, curious and brief, from a tailor's apprentice named Felix Harrow, now working at Whitlock's. I have seen the serpent. The message read, "Come alone, noon." Holmes arrived early, alone as instructed, while I waited nearby, just out of view. He entered through the rear alleyway, leaving the door open just a crack. Through it I could hear the apprentice's trembling voice. "They told me never to ask questions," Harrow said, almost whispering, "only to press the hems as instructed. But I found a slip, sir, fell from a seam. I hid it. I didn't know what it was at first." "You've done well," Holmes replied. "Tell me who gave you the suits." There was a pause. "I don't know his name," Harrow answered slowly. "But he was no tailor. He had ink stains on his fingers, smelled of camphor, always came late, never spoke more than necessary." Holmes's voice grew quieter. "Would you recognize his voice again?" Harrow hesitated, then nodded. That evening, Holmes prepared what I can only describe as theatrical misdirection. He invited each of the suspects we had encountered, Raddick, Bell, even the unassuming Cutter, Mr. Cranley to one be under various pretenses. Raddick was told he would review new evidence against him. Bell was lured with the promise of a confession. Cranler was offered employment with a fictitious client. When they arrived, each man was kept in the sitting room for no more than 3 minutes. Holmes stood behind a privacy screen while I recorded their voices under the guise of note-taking. None of them saw Harrow, hidden in the room next door, separated only by a thin veil of curtain. When the last man left, Holmes entered the adjoining room. "Well?" It was the second voice. Harrow said without hesitation. "He called you Mr. Holmes, but said it the way a man speaks to an equal, not afraid. Like he was playing along. Mortimer Bell." Holmes said softly, "As I suspected." Still, Holmes made no move to confront him. Instead, he turned back to the laboratory and set about preparing a strange concoction: 1 part oil, 1 part alcohol, and crushed crystal from a packet I didn't recognize. "Burn test." He explained briefly, "Some forgeries are printed with trace wax that only reveals itself when exposed to direct heat." He took one of the bond slips Harrow had hidden and lit the edge with a match. The paper curled, blackened and then, just before it turned to ash, faint letters shimmered across the surface. "Series 9. Batch 4. He murmured. "Forgery serials?" I asked. "No," he said grimly. "Inventory numbers. for distribution. They weren't just hiding these, they were trading them. He pulled out the ledger we had recovered, flipped back to the final page. In the margin, the serpent mark had been drawn beside a series of symbols. Holmes took a charcoal pencil and began transcribing the pattern onto clean parchment. After several minutes, he sat back and stared at it. I had assumed the symbol was merely decorative, a signature of sorts. But it's not. It's code. Needle positions on a tailor's form waist. Inseam, cuff, hem, shoulder. The numbers represent measurements, but the values aren't consistent with clothing. Their coordinates, grid markers, locations. He jabbed a finger at the last number. This one points to an abandoned warehouse by the Thames destroyed. In the 1899 fire, I believe the final drop was scheduled there. That night, we arrived at the ruins. The building had long since collapsed, but beneath the scorched beams, Holmes uncovered a hidden crate beneath a rusted metal hatch. Inside were dozens more forged bonds and a single sealed envelope. Holmes opened it carefully, hands steady. The letter inside was written in Vale's hand or someone mimicking it flawlessly. If you are reading this, the serpent has failed, but the thread unravels both ways, in cloth and blood alike. No signature, just a final cryptic emblem of the serpent eating its own tail. Holmes closed the letter and looked at me with an expression that hovered between triumph and sorrow. There's only one thing left, Watson, one final test, not of cloth, nor ink, nor voice, but of guilt. How? Holmes smiled faintly. By giving Mr. Bell exactly what he wants and watching him reach for it. It was just past dawn when we returned to Baker Street, the Thames mist still clinging to our coats. The serpent's letter folded neatly inside Holmes's inner pocket. Holmes lit the fire without a word, stoked it until the flame roared high, and then stood before it with his fingers steepled in thought. The weight of the night's discovery hung thick in the air. Yet there was no time to savor the breakthrough. It was, as Holmes had said, merely the last piece before the final test. He laid the sealed crate on the table and examined it again. Watson, I shall entrust you with its inventory. Catalogue each slip, each document. Take note of any inconsistencies in serial numbers or ink composition. I must prepare for a visit. To Bell, I asked. To the man who has tried all night to stay one step ahead of me. He believes himself unseen, but a shadow always falls somewhere. While Holmes vanished into the foggy morning, I began the task. The crate held 48 forged bonds, a velvet pouch of counterfeit wax seals, and a half-torn ledger page tucked between the folds of linen. It listed to names not previously encountered, both connected, I suspected, to the wider ring Holmes now saw forming in full. I was only halfway through the examination when a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Lestrade, face drawn and pale. There's been a fire, he said shortly. Whitlock's laundry, burned to the ground not 2 hours past. Apprentice Harrow is missing. My hands stilled. Was it arson? Lestrade nodded grimly. No doubt. Back door forced, storage records incinerated. Someone wanted the place wiped clean. The fire wasn't the only blow upon Holmes's return. He found the latch on our study window unfastened, a tiny detail. The kind most men would miss, but not Holmes. His eyes narrowed as he stepped inside. "Someone's been here." I rushed to the crate. At first glance, nothing seemed disturbed. The forged bonds remained. Neatly stacked, the pouch still lay beside them. But when I reached for the letter, the serpent's letter, it was gone. Holmes's fury was not loud, but cold and sharp. Only one person knew of that letter beyond ourselves. He said, "Bell." How could he have known where to find it, let alone slip past undetected? Because he never left us, Watson. He's been 3 moves ahead, playing not the tailor, but the puppeteer. And someone close, someone within arm's reach is feeding him everything. The realization settled like frost on the back of my neck. Cranler? No. Holmes said darkly. Raddick, the tailor's supposed rival. He's not a rival at all. He's a silencer, paid to throw dust in our eyes and eliminate loose ends. If Harrow is missing, it's Raddick who took him. But why remove the letter now? Because it named no names but hinted at the structure. Holmes muttered. Bell feared I might decrypt it. He was right to. Lestrade, now visibly shaken, paced beside the hearth. "You'll have to move quickly. Holmes, the fire spooked my superiors. They want the matter closed. If I can't present a solution by tomorrow, they'll dismiss the case entirely." Holmes's reply was curt. "Then we act tonight." He ordered that the crate be transported to a discreet vault beneath Scotland Yard's archive hall, under the guard of a trusted clerk. Holmes alone would carry the remaining forged slip to lure Bell into the open. That evening, with the city cloaked in drizzle and soot, Holmes visited Bell's townhouse once more. The excuse was thinner request for financial verification on behalf of the Yard, but Bell welcomed him with unnerving calm. "You're not here about bonds," he said as the parlor doors closed. "You're here for the serpent." Holmes gave nothing away. Should I be? Bell's smile faltered. "I underestimated you, Holmes. I thought you'd be satisfied with Vale's death. Most men are content with a corpse, but you, A.M., interested in the stitching," Holmes said, voice a razor. "The thread that connects Vale to Raddick and to you. You have no proof," Bell said evenly. "Nothing that stands up in court. Even the evidence you gathered, it's already vanishing. Isn't it?" Holmes met his eyes. "That depends on whether you choose to vanish with it." For a flicker of a second, Bell's expression cracked, just enough. Holmes stood slowly. "You'll make your next move tonight, I assume. The vault beneath Scotland Yard. Do tell Raddick I left a key under the 3rd stone at the entrance. He'll know which one." Bell's eyes narrowed. "You'd bait your trap that openly?" Holmes's voice was cool as sleet. "He won't resist. Men like Raddick never do." That night, I stood with Lestrade in the shadows outside the Yard. A carriage rolled up precisely at 1 o'clock. 2 men emerged. One wore a long overcoat, the other Raddick. They didn't see the plainclothes constables until the vault door closed behind them and the lanterns flared up, trapping them within. Raddick snarled and reached inside his coat, but Holmes stepped from behind a column and pressed the barrel of a revolver to the man's temple. "Do try to keep the fabric clean," Holmes said softly. Inside the vault, the crate sat empty, but not because its contents had been stolen. They had never been there to begin with. Holmes had transferred the real evidence to the care of a discreet banking house earlier that day. Bell never showed. "He's clever," Holmes admitted afterward. He suspected the trap, but Radic was always the bolder fool. "Now we wait. Bell won't flee, he's too proud. He'll try to erase the trail himself." "And what of Harrow?" I asked. Holmes looked out across the darkened Thames. "If Radic had him, he would have confessed under pressure. But he didn't. That means Bell has him, and he won't keep him long." There was silence for a moment. Then Holmes turned, his face grim. "We're close, Watson. But now every piece we've gained is at risk. One more slip and the entire case may vanish like smoke." It was just past 5 in the morning when the summons came, urgent, sharp, and bearing the unmistakable stamp of desperation. A runner from Scotland Yard, soaked to the skin, pounded on our door with reddened knuckles and breathless news. Another body had been found. The address 33 Whitegate Lane was unfamiliar, but Holmes needed no prompting. Radic spoke of a place in Shoreditch where payments were sorted, he said while pulling on his coat. He called it a depot. "This will be that place, but the body won't be his." We arrived at the scene as grey dawn seeped through the soot of London's skyline. The house was low and narrow, flanked by warehouses and a cooper's yard. Inside, the scent of oil and decay hung heavy in the air. The body lay in the cellar, crumpled beneath a hanging lamp that swung gently in the draught. It was Cranler. He was seated, mouth agape, hands bound behind him with white thread-knot rope tailor's thread. His face was bloodied, but it wasn't the injuries that drew Holmes's eye. It was the deliberate way he had been posed, upright, dressed in a clean shirt, coat buttoned. His chin had been lifted post-mortem, tied with a silk scarf to appear almost regal. There was a note pinned to his lapel. It read simply, "A master's final fitting." Lestrade, pale and shaken, looked to Holmes. "Message?" Holmes nodded. "And a performance. Bell wants us to know he's still in control. Radic's capture didn't slow him, it provoked him." I bent over the corpse. "Why Cranler?" He was wary, but harmless. Holmes crouched beside me, eyes scanning the room. Not harmless. He stitched 2 uniforms for Vale, and was likely privy to Bell's finances. He knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, and perhaps literally, and that made him dangerous. "But posed like this?" I asked. "Symbolic," Holmes replied. "This isn't about death, it's about message control. Bell's ensuring every loose thread is sewn up. But he's getting reckless. Leaving bodies is a risk." Holmes moved to a shelf cluttered with ledgers and dye pots, brushing aside tools and wax-sealed envelopes. He froze at a stack of appointment books, 3 volumes bound in calfskin. One was missing pages, crudely torn out. He examined the tear, then sniffed the edge of the paper. Sulfur. Whoever removed these burned them on sight. He looked to the hearth. "Watson, the ash." I stooped and sifted carefully through the cinders with my gloves. Among the grey-black mass lay a half-charred scrap of paper. Holmes retrieved it with tweezers, examined the ink, then gave a quiet, sharp breath. A ledger note, Bell's private mark and a date. Tomorrow. Lestrade leaned over. Tomorrow? Something's planned, Holmes said grimly. A final act. We don't have the location, but we have the pattern. We returned to Baker Street with the ominous silence of pre-storm tension pressing around us. The light was still poor, the fire struggling in the grate. Holmes pinned the recovered note to the wall beside the others and stared at them in sequence. There is a rhythm to his strikes, he muttered. Bell uses precision, pattern, symmetry like a tailor. He delivers a statement, waits, and moves. Cranley's death fits the cycle. But this new note breaks it. It's early, which means he's escalating. He reached for a map of London, already scarred with pins and notes. Watson, recall Vale's ledger. The client code D77? Yes. Holmes circled a narrow alley in the East End. I checked it against a shipping manifest last night. D77 was listed as receiving bonded freight from the docks. That's illegal unless one has government exemption. Bell's cover must be in play there. But how does that help us now? Holmes narrowed his eyes. Because that depot also held to names scratched in the corner of Vale's crate harrow. And Sutton. Sutton was a junior clerk who vanished 6 months ago, declared absent without cause. I thought it irrelevant until now. He turned swiftly. Bell isn't just tying loose ends, he's cleansing the archive. Anyone who ever handled these accounts is at risk. At that moment, the door to 2-to-1B burst open with such force that Mrs. Hudson shrieked from below. A constable stumbled, in blood trailing down his temple. Inspector Lestrade, he's been taken. The words stopped the room. The constable gasped, intercepted on his way to the yard. Carriage cut across him on Crown Street. We found the driver unconscious in the alley. Lestrade's gone, vanished. Holmes's fists clenched, but his voice remained icily calm. Then the attack has already begun. He moved like lightning, gathering notes, tucking a revolver into his coat, and motioning for me. We go to D77 now. Bell won't wait for dawn. He's staging the endgame tonight. We arrived just as the rain began to fall in earnest. The warehouse squatted like a sleeping beast in the fog. Holmes signaled for silence, drew his weapon, and motioned to the rear. I followed. We crept through a broken grate into the lower store, where crates were stacked haphazardly. A groan echoed faintly. Holmes's eyes flicked upward. We climbed a side stair, boots quiet on rusted metal. Lestrade was there bound to. A chair, gagged, eyes blazing but alive. Beside him stood Bell, hands raised, smiling faintly. Behind him, a fuse was burning slow and steady toward a barrel marked with an explosive seal. Holmes didn't hesitate. Step away, he commanded. Bell's smile didn't fade. You're too late, Holmes. I built the fire months ago. You only saw the smoke today. Holmes advanced, gun steady. You've lost. Raddick is captured. Your ring is exposed. Even your silence has become noise. Bell chuckled, exposed. You found my pawn, my decoys. but the true cut like the finest stitches invisible. He reached into his coat. Holmes fired one slow. Bell staggered, a crimson bloom spreading. Across his thigh, he collapsed, shrieking, as Holmes rushed to douse the fuse. I cut Lestrade free. He nodded weakly. Warehouse, full of records, beneath the floor. Holmes turned to Bell, who writhed against the boards. Your mistake was the flourish, a tailor's pride undone by vanity. Bell coughed blood and spat. You never undo it all. Holmes straightened. Perhaps not. But I will make certain it's no longer yours. As dawn broke once again over London, the last of the ledgers were recovered. The flames extinguished before they could consume the past. But the air was still thick with unease, for if Bell had managed to vanish so much already, how much more had he hidden? Holmes stood over the warehouse ledgers with weary eyes. This isn't a victory, he said quietly. It's a reprieve. The stitch may be cut, but the pattern remains. Holmes stood in the warehouse's dim morning light, unmoving. Lestrade had been taken and rescued. Bell had been wounded and rested. The warehouse's floorboards had revealed a cache of ledgers, invoices, and coded client lists. And yet, despite the sense of resolution swirling around the yard's operatives as they processed the scene, I recognized the unmistakable rigidity in Holmes's posture. He was not satisfied. He knelt once more at the crate where the charred ledger fragment had been found, drawing a finger slowly along the edge. I joined him, watching as he paused at a hinge-fitted oddly countersunk on the inside. Rather than flush, Holmes took out his penknife and pried gently until a small, flat compartment gave way. Inside lay a folded scrap of parchment. Holmes unfolded it without a word. The writing was faint, etched in pencil, and smudged at the edges. Measure twice, cut once. B4, F7, H3. I stared at the note. Coordinates? Holmes shook his head. No. Stitch patterns. Bell was never just a smuggler, he was an archivist of sorts. I believe these are entries in a bespoke tailoring index, coded to names or locations. But that doesn't explain the phrase, measure twice, cut once. That's just a tradesman's motto. Is it? Holmes murmured. Or is it a confession in disguise? He rose swiftly and gestured for me to follow him outside. The rain had passed, leaving a shimmering wetness on the cobbles. Holmes turned left, then right, retracing steps in precise sequence. At last he halted at a boarded-up storefront and abandoned tailor's shop. 2 streets down from the warehouse, the name had been scrubbed from the awning, but faint lettering remained. F. Vale, Master Cutter. He pointed at the faded paint. Vale's personal shop, closed for over a year. I had it noted early on, but the timeline didn't fit. He withdrew a key taken from Bell's pocket and slid it into the rusted lock. The door creaked open, revealing moth-eaten suits, half-assembled mannequins, and rolls of untouched fabric. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by our breath. Holmes's eyes scanned the space quickly, then fixated on a thread rack in the back. He stepped forward and reached for a spool labeled F7. It turned with a click. Another H3 clicked in turn. Then be dash for a low grind emerged from beneath the cutting table. A concealed drawer opened, revealing not cloth, but paper's pages bound not in leather, but in plain waxed linen. Holmes withdrew the volume carefully. He turned the first page, and his face changed, not triumphant, not surprised, but deeply, profoundly focused. "This," he said slowly, "is the true archive." The pages were not financial records or orders. They were transcripts, dialogues, conversations recorded in shorthand and cipher, noting names, times, locations, moods. Some dated back 6 years. One entry read, "Client Bell requests silence for Operation Winter Button. Seeks removal of apprentice who overheard. Tailor refuses. Tension noted." Another, "Assistant are paid to disappear. Package left at station." Holmes flipped to the center. His eyes scanned the entries, and then stopped. "Watson," he said, voice taut, "this is what we missed." He handed me the page. It bore a single entry, stark and dated 2 months before Raddick's so-called disappearance. Raddick meets with Vale, discusses burnt suit incident. Bell overhears. Threats exchanged. Raddick offers deal. "I stitch your alibi. You forget the fire." Vale refuses. Next morning, fire at workshop. My breath caught. Raddick staged the fire himself. Holmes nodded grimly. To frame Bell, or to eliminate Vale's hold over him. Either way, the fire was never Bell's doing. It was a cover for Raddick's double play. Raddick, not Bell, fabricated the original alibi by planting the tailor's own jacket, and Bell used it, willingly or not. He turned back to the file and read aloud. "This explains the pattern, the suits, the thread, the coded logs." Each alibi was tailored not just for protection, but for leverage. Vale's skill was not only in fabric, but in narrative. He flipped further and paused at a curious line. "Jacket 14. Delivered to H. Holmes. Altered lining. My pulse quickened. Your name." Holmes met my gaze. "It's not a mistake. I recall that winter. You'll remember I received an unexpected parcel from a grateful client, a wool jacket that I never wore. I kept it, suspicious of the origin, and stored it in the attic. We returned immediately to Baker Street. The attic chest yielded the coat navy wool, excellent cut, pristine condition. Holmes examined the lining, then with surgical precision, made a single incision beneath the hem. From within, he extracted a folded strip of parchment. Another transcript. This one read, March 3rd, 1888. Client R requests exit. Demands identity scrub. Payment. Jacket to be sent via misdirection to H. Holmes recipient unaware. Thread count modified to include sealing detail. Holmes exhaled sharply. He used me, not as an accomplice, but as a courier. I unknowingly transported his final record. I stared. "And why include your name?" "To taunt you. To ensure it would survive," Holmes replied. He knew I'd never destroy it, and that I'd eventually return to it. Vale was clever. His pattern wasn't cloth, it was preservation. He rose, went to the desk, and began arranging each recovered note from the shop and warehouse into order. A grid formed dates, initials, events, symbols. Slowly, The chaos became structure. Holmes stepped back, and for the first time in days, I saw a light in his eyes not born of frustration or fatigue. "It's a language," he said softly. He left a signature, a method of recording every lie stitched into every alibi. The tailoring wasn't a metaphor. It was the crime. I nodded slowly. So the motive was never just money or secrecy. Holmes's voice was low and precise. It was control, tailoring a life, a history, an identity. He gave criminals the appearance of truth in exchange for their silence, and used their own fabrications to blackmail them. But when he threatened to turn honest, they killed him, and then each other, outside. The bells of St. Bartholomew chimed 10. The fog had thinned, but its weight remained on the streets. Holmes closed the file, turned toward the hearth, and spoke without looking at me. "The tailor didn't just sew his own alibi, Watson. He embroidered it so deeply into others that his truth was always hidden in someone else's lie. And now, finally, the thread has begun to unravel." Holmes sat, motionless in the armchair, hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the flickering fireplace. Outside, Baker Street was washed in late afternoon gloom, the fog thickening again as though London herself meant to obscure the revelations just uncovered. I stood by the window, the jacket from Vale's hidden archive laid neatly on the desk, its lining slit with surgical precision. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Holmes murmured, "There is still a gap, Watson, a terrible one." I turned. "We've uncovered the archive, the mechanism of the crime, and the manipulation that followed. What remains?" He looked up. "The motive. Not the smuggling, not the blackmail that was means, but the act that started all this. The murder of Francis Vale, a man as careful as he, with leverage over dangerous people. Why was he eliminated? And why then?" It was the right question. Everything pointed to Raddick. Yet the trail stopped just short of proving he wielded the knife. Holmes rose suddenly and retrieved the stitched grid he had constructed from Vale's notes. He circled a portion near the center, where 3 threads converged: Bell, Raddick, and an unknown set of initials. "ES, I passed over this too quickly," he muttered. "We assumed ES to be a minor accomplice, perhaps a handler or courier. But Vale marked this entry with a red symbol. He only used it when recording danger. See here, March 14th, the night before the fire." He read aloud, "Client ES arrives unexpectedly, argues with Vale over missing file. Shouting heard by apprentice. Vale refuses handover. ES threatens to expose hidden ledger. Leaves in haste." My brow furrowed. But ES doesn't appear in the client records, nor in the constabularies. "Interviews." "Precisely," Holmes said, voice sharp, "because ES was not a client. Not in the conventional sense." He turned, grabbed his violin case, not for the instrument, but for the notebook he often kept tucked inside. Its lid, pages flipped rapidly until he found what he sought: a hand-drawn map of Limehouse, annotated from the earliest stage of the case. "Do you remember this?" he asked, pointing to a red square. "The old seamstress cooperative," I said. "Burned down 3 years ago. Accidental fire. No charges filed." Holmes nodded slowly. Vale's sister, Edith, seamstress, co-owner, and according to census. Records I pulled before we ever left for the docks, his only surviving family. I stared at him. Yes, Edith Vale. She changed her name to Edith Stroud after the fire, presumably to distance herself from the scandal. I believe she blamed her brother for the loss, not of the business, but of something far more personal. He strode to the mantel and tapped the coded ledger with a knuckle. She knew of this archive. She likely helped construct it, cutting threads, hiding records, and she knew what he kept hidden. But when Vale refused to hand over a specific file, something she believed he owed her, she retaliated. My voice was low. You believe she killed him? I believe she arranged for someone else to do it. Radek was her instrument, not the master. She supplied the opportunity, perhaps even suggested the alibi. But the emotional force, jealousy, betrayal, those came from her. He turned back to the file and flipped to the final entry. It read simply, March 15th, ES returns. Vale does not open door. Footsteps heard. Lock forced. A beat passed. Watson, Holmes said. This wasn't a crime of profit or fear. It was one of rejection. She had sacrificed everything for him, her name, her livelihood, perhaps even her safety. And when he refused her final request, she responded in kind. He stepped away from the grid, eyes distant. She saw herself as the architect behind his power, the needle to his thread. And when he wouldn't share what she considered hers, she unraveled him. But what file? I asked. What was so important she would kill her own brother for it? Holmes turned back to the coat, retrieved the jacket again, and removed a second slip from beneath its hidden seam. This, he said, was misfiled in the lining, not a client record and adoption certificate. I leaned closer. For a child, name redacted. Holmes's mouth was grim. Francis Vale adopted a child in secret 18 years ago. Female. No mother listed. The dates match. The girl would be nearly grown now. If Edith believed he had taken her daughter, hidden her, erased her past, she would see it as the ultimate betrayal. He fell silent. The fire crackled behind him, casting long shadows across the room. At last, he said, "We must find her, Watson. Not to arrest, not yet, but to understand, to see the last stitch in the pattern, because only she can confirm what." Francis Vale refused to tell anyone why he did what he did, and what he was protecting when he died. I nodded, the weight of the truth sinking like a stone in my chest. The crime, as it turned out, had not been born in greed or blackmail, though both had grown like ivy across its frame. At its heart, it was the story of a broken family of secrets buried beneath layers of loyalty and loss, and of a tailor who, in trying to bind everything together, had stitched himself into a tragedy far deeper than anyone had guessed. It was in the soft gloom of twilight, that curious hour when London's fog and lamplight conspire to distort shape and shadow, that Holmes requested we return to the shop where it had all begun. Coatsworth and Vale, still boarded at the front, stood silent beneath the gaslight. Holmes had arranged for Sergeant Griggs and 2 constables to wait in the alley beside the shop. Out of sight, on strict instruction not to intervene until summoned. Inside, the air was colder than memory, as if the final act had drained the very warmth from the scene. Holmes moved with silent purpose, drawing the curtains, lighting the lamp on the rear desk, the same one where we had first found the twisted needle and the stitched symbols. But this time, he left the door unlocked and ajar. He set down the coat from the archive, now restored to its full shape. The lining lay exposed just so, revealing the hidden pocket, the place where the adoption record had been tucked, and beside it, the grid of thread and parchment unfolded, decoded, and, now damning, "You're certain she'll come?" I asked softly. "She has no choice," Holmes replied. "She's been watching us, Watson." She moved before we ever approached the archive, anticipated the raid, even attempted to burn evidence. But now she knows I've seen through the final seam. We didn't wait long. At precisely 8:15, the door creaked, opened behind us. Holmes didn't turn. He simply said, "Good evening, Miss Stroud." She stepped inside without sound, dressed in a pale grey cloak that made her near invisible against the dusty shelves. Edith Vale now Stroud wore no mask of fear nor arrogance, only quiet resignation. Her eyes, sharp and dry, passed over the coat, the grid, the adoption certificate laid bare. Holmes gestured calmly. "I believe you came for this." She didn't speak. Her hands did not tremble, though I saw her left fingers twitch at the sight of the folded paper. Holmes continued, tone level. "You told Raddick to press Vale when he refused. You made the arrangements. You knew the layout, the timing, even the thread patterns in the apprentice's coat that gave him away. Raddick thought he was doing your bidding for money, for leverage, but he was only the knife. You were the hand." Still she said nothing. "I found the girl," Holmes added, "or rather, the home where Vale had placed her. Quiet family, up near Gloucester. She has no idea who her birth mother is." That was the first crack in her composure. Her jaw tightened, eyes flicking to Holmes, then back to the coat. "I wasn't going to take her from them," Holmes said softly. "You had a choice, Miss Stroud. You could have told your brother the truth, but you didn't want truth. You wanted control over it." "Control," she said at last, voice rough with disuse. "He took everything from me. He protected the child," Holmes said, "perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear. But you burned your past to punish your future." Her lip curled faintly. "You think you understand, but you don't. He made me part of his world. His dark little trade of names and threats and quiet envelopes. I helped him build that web. I was the web. And when I finally asked for something for once, he said no." Holmes nodded. "Just once. So you unraveled him, thread by thread." A silence followed. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and picked up the adoption paper. Her fingers ran over it with a strange tenderness. "Will you tell her?" she asked. "No," Holmes replied, "unless you want her to know." She stared at the page a long moment. "What happens now?" "That," Holmes said gently, "is up to you." And then the last moment of truth came. She turned. Perhaps to walk away, perhaps to run, We'll never know. But Sergeant Griggs stepped through the doorway then, and in her expression I saw the weight settle, the last stitch. She did not resist. She laid the paper down and lifted her hands. Her fingers were red with old dye ink. Perhaps, but no one reached to take her arm. She walked forward of her own accord, as the constables led her out into the night. Holmes sat again at the desk. The coat, the map of threads, the adoption certificate, they remained untouched before him, like relics of a finished design. She could have vanished, I said at last, started over, taken the secret to her grave. Holmes looked up, the fire returning to his eyes, though it was not triumph I saw there, but something gentler. She came because she needed someone to see it, not just the crime, but why. The tailor stitched his alibi, yes, but his sister, she sewed her vengeance into every hidden seam, and in the end she chose to let it unravel. Outside, the fog folded in on itself once more. But for the first time since the case began, I felt something break through it. Not clarity, perhaps, but closure. The door had scarcely clicked shut behind Edith Stroud when Holmes remained motionless, eyes still fixed on the grid of thread atop the tailor's desk. The silence that followed was not one of victory, but of tension hanging by a single thread. Something gnawed at him, something not yet aligned. I saw it in the sharp stillness of his gaze, not triumphant, but disturbed. "Holmes?" I asked, lowering my voice. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he rose, circled the table once, and retrieved the coat, the very one Vale had made for his apprentice, the one with the secreted adoption document. He held it to the light, studying the inner lining again, not with the eye of a man, confirming a fact, but of one desperately seeking the flaw in a pattern he had trusted too soon. "Tell me, Watson," he said abruptly, "why would Edith keep this? The document, perhaps sentiment, or guilt, exactly, and yet she brought nothing else when she came to confront me. No confession, no plea, no message for the girl, only this left behind, not taken, as if it no longer mattered." He laid the coat down carefully. "Because it never mattered." I stared. "But she confessed." "No," Holmes cut in. "She let us believe she did." My chest tightened. "You think she's innocent?" "Not innocent," he muttered, pacing now. "Complicit, yes. Orchestrator, no. But she was present the night of Vale's death. She was—" Holmes interrupted again. "But someone else was already there." The words hung there a moment before the full weight of them sank into the room. Holmes turned sharply toward the shop's back wall, eyes narrowing as if some long-forgotten noise had returned. He moved to the filing cabinets behind. Vale's worktable, the same drawers we'd searched early in the investigation. "She wanted revenge," Holmes said, pulling drawers open rapidly, "but she lacked one thing. A killer's resolve. No, an innate understanding of Vale's secret world." He paused, then removed the last drawer entirely. Behind it, where the panel met the wall, was a recessed plank. Holmes pressed it once and, with a faint mechanical sigh, the wall released an inch, revealing a narrow hidden compartment. Inside was a second coating marked unfinished. but identical in cut and structure to the apprentice's, and within its lining, not a document this time, but something that made Holmes go absolutely still. A small vial, stoppered with wax. The fluid inside was pale blue. Holmes held it gently by its neck, his expression unreadable. Prussic acid, he said. Undetectable in tea when masked by bitter herbs. Highly fatal. And this is not Edith's work. Then whose? Holmes didn't answer right away. Instead, he crossed to the desk and pulled from his notebook the sketches he'd made, thread sequences, stitch diagrams, seam spacing. He compared the coat in the compartment to the ones Vale had made, and then to the master tailor's. Final works catalogued at the archive. After a long pause, he exhaled. This stitching is newer, more precise, but it's not Vale's hand. He turned slowly to face me. Watson, who had the most to lose if Vale's secrets were exposed? Who stood to inherit not only the business, but the network beneath it? I answered before I realized it. The apprentice. Holmes nodded grimly. Silas. The idea struck me hard, yet it made chilling sense. Silas, who had been so quiet, so poised, who had stayed just enough on the edges not to seem relevant, but who had also, cleverly, always known exactly when to appear. He had claimed to have found Vale's body, but had arrived too quickly. He had offered Edith's name with just the right mix of uncertainty and moral cover. Holmes grabbed his coat. We must find him. Now, by the time we arrived at Silas's rented room off Islington Row, the street lamps were burning low, and the smell of distant rain was thick in the air. A landlady in curlers confirmed that Silas had packed hastily that morning and departed. Didn't say where, she added with a shrug. Left behind nothing but some old cloth scraps. Holmes tore through the single room in seconds. Inside a small valise beneath the bed, he found correspondence notes written in Vale's hand to Silas, dating back several years. But one, dated only days before the murder, bore a curious addition. In a firmer hand. You're not ready. It ends now. Holmes read it aloud, then looked up with a grim smile. Vale was preparing to cut him out. But why? I asked. Because he realized, Holmes said, what Silas had become. The last note Silas left behind was folded into the pocket of a coat, tucked almost as if by accident. Holmes unfolded it slowly. It read, a master leaves his mark in Fred, but a true heir leaves it in silence. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. The house of Coatsworth and Vale ends here not by fire, but by choice. She tried to preserve the past. I will bury it. I win. The note was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. Holmes stared at the paper for a long time. So, I said, the final pieces locking in place, Edith brought us to the threshold. But he was the hand behind the killing. He used her guilt and vengeance to mask his own ambition. Holmes muttered, played them both his mentor and his mentor's sister. And now he's vanished. But can he vanish? I asked. He's young, Holmes said, and clever. But he's a tailor, Watson. And tailors carry their work with them. His eyes lit briefly, a flash of certainty amid the storm. And I know exactly where his next stitch will fall to. Days later, the air over London was sharp with the sting of early frost, and the sky had turned that peculiar color Holmes always claimed, announced the settling of matters pale steel, ringed with dull gold. We were waiting near the West India docks, amid the calls of gulls and the churn of low tide against hulls. Holmes stood with his collar up, hands clasped behind him, watching the cargo vessels load and unload with methodical indifference. "It has to be this one," he said quietly, nodding toward the Artemis, a mid-sized trading ship scheduled for departure under a false manifest bound for Algiers. I didn't need to ask how he knew. Silas had nowhere else to run. Every safe House Vale might have provided had been dismantled with surgical precision. Once Holmes traced the web backward, the apprentice, for all his foresight, had made one final mistake. He'd reused a stitch. Pattern Holmes had already flagged a distinct loop variation only he used in repairing a waistcoat. Found in an open-air market just days prior, the merchant hadn't remembered much, but the pattern had spoken volumes. "Do you think he'll resist?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "He believes he's already won. That makes him careless." Sure enough, as the last of the cargo was secured, a figure in a navy peacoat approached the ramp, carrying nothing but a small satchel. The cap was pulled low, but even at distance, the stride was unmistakable, confident, composed, calculated. Holmes stepped forward first. "Mr. Vale," he called. Silas stopped. There was no panic in the young man's expression, only the briefest flicker of annoyance. Like a chess player watching a pawn slip out of position, he turned slowly, as if inconvenienced by the world's inability to leave him alone. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice calm. "But you're too late." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, motioning to the two inspectors closing in from either side. "I'd say just in time." Silas did not bolt. He didn't plead. He simply smiled. "I never wanted the legacy," he said, "only the silence that came with it." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet you made so much noise. Silas, a poisoned master, a shattered family, a vanishing act fit for fiction, and all along you hid behind other people's grief, their motives, Edith's especially." "She was already broken," Silas said with a shrug. "I only let her believe she had cause. You gave her the ending she wanted. I gave myself a clean escape." "But you left a trail of your own making," Holmes said, stepping closer. "In every altered stitch, you changed the pattern of a dying man's work just enough to leave your own signature. And it cost you, perhaps," Silas said softly, eyes narrowing. "But tell me, Holmes, even now, what does this bring you? Peace? Justice? You of all people must understand. The system doesn't truly punish clever men. It just waits for them to start again. The inspectors seized him then, with force but no drama." Holmes didn't flinch, didn't gloat. He simply watched as Silas was led away, the ship's ramp rising behind him. The opportunity to disappear into another life sealed off for good. We remained at the dock some time longer, the cold creeping into our boots, silence settling between us. "He wasn't wrong," I said at last. "About the system?" "No," Holmes murmured. "But the system is not what I serve, Watson." "And what do you serve?" He turned, his expression unreadable, save for a faint gleam of something like exhaustion or, perhaps, finally, satisfaction. The pattern later that evening, seated once more at Baker Street with the fire crackling and the last light of day, catching in Holmes's violin strings as he tuned them absent-mindedly. I pressed him on the clues I had missed. The poisoned coat. I said, "That vial. How did you know it was Silas's doing and not Edith's?" "The seams," Holmes said without looking up. "The lining was stitched in haste, but with a precision Edith lacked. Silas worked faster than Vale, but more mechanically. His method was always neat but soulless. And the document she left behind, a red herring. Edith had already burned the original document, Watson. The one she left us was a copy she forged it to provoke a confrontation, hoping I'd discover what Vale had done. But she never expected Silas to act first." I leaned back, absorbing the layers. "You always knew, didn't you, that Silas was hiding something?" "Not always," Holmes admitted. "But the lie that gave him away was the smallest of all. When he said Vale never let anyone use his shears, and yet, when I examined the tailor's hand, there was no deep callousy. Hadn't been working in the final days. Someone else had taken up the blade. The violin's bowmet string, and the note it produced was soft, solemn. So, I said, justice is served." Holmes paused mid-bow. For now. I knew what he meant. That Silas Vale, for all his crimes, was not the last of his kind. That others would hide behind their own clever patterns. That evil, like thread, could be looped and twisted in forms deceptively beautiful. But I also knew this. As long as Sherlock Holmes walked among them, someone was watching the seams. The morning after Silas Vale's arrest dawned slow and grey. London, ever indifferent to the drama of men, seemed to exhale, letting its fog settle across rooftops like a final curtain. Holmes was quiet over breakfast than usual, though not entirely unfamiliar. He often grew pensive after the completion of a case, as if the thrill of the chase left behind a void even he struggled to ignore. I busied myself with the morning paper, scanning the front page where the headline read, "Tailor's Apprentice. Behind Notorious Murder, Sherlock Holmes Cracks Case." There was no mention of Edith Mallory, nor of the deeper psychological undercurrents Holmes had uncovered. Only the neat summary the press adored, clean, resolved, palatable, and wrong in the way all summaries are. Holmes sipped his tea with a distracted air. Then he set down his cup, unfolded a small scrap of paper from the inside pocket of his dressing gown, and stared at it for some time. It was the note Silas had left in his cell before being transferred to prison. Nothing formal. Just a torn piece of ledger paper with a single sentence written in pencil. "You never asked why I chose that coat." Holmes had shown it to me once already, dismissing it as a final provocation. But now I saw the crease in his brow, the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth. "There's something still bothering you," I said. He didn't look up. "There's always something. Silas is behind bars. The documents are safe. The Mallory family has closed their shop. What more can possibly be unresolved? Holmes finally met my gaze. He could have chosen any garment in Vale's workshop to lace with poison, but he didn't. And it was a navy wool coat. Watson, bespoke, but unfinished. Do you remember where I saw its match? I thought for a moment. Then it clicked. The same cloth, yes. That strange visitor weeks ago. The one who came asking about chemical dyes and bespoke fittings. Precisely, Holmes said. Only he never gave a name, and he paid in coin. I kept the sample he left behind for comparison. It was the same bolt Vale used to make that final coat. I narrowed my eyes. You think someone else requested it? That Silas wasn't acting entirely on his own. Silas was brilliant, but not inventive. He didn't plan this alone. Watson, he executed it, stitched it together like a commissioned piece, but the design belonged to someone else. And you think that someone is still out there? He didn't answer, but his silence was its own confirmation. A knock at the door pulled us from our thoughts. Mrs. Hudson entered with the day's post, most of it forgettable, except one envelope without a return address, sealed in wax bearing an insignia I couldn't quite make out. Holmes opened it carefully, scanned the note inside, and then passed it to me without a word. The handwriting was bold, almost theatrical. Congratulations on reaching the henline. But the pattern continues. Holmes stood abruptly, crossed to the bookshelf, and pulled down one of his private ledgers. He flipped to a section marked Only by, an unassuming strip of ribbon. Inside were press clippings, some yellowed with age, others recent. All unsolved cases, all involving poisons, disappearances, or items of clothing left behind. He tapped one at random. A banker in Venice, found dead in an opera cloak. Another, a solicitor in Paris, suffocated by a silk cravat. Another still, a woman in Marrakesh, vanished after purchasing a wedding gown. Are you saying these are related? I asked. I'm saying they might be. Holmes's eyes glittered with a kind of cold clarity. The thread may have led to Silas, but the hand guiding the needle remains hidden. I felt a chill not from the fireless hearth, but from the suggestion that what we had witnessed was merely a portion of a grander design one, whose pattern had not yet fully emerged. Later that day, Holmes left alone, as he often did when something troubled him deeply. He didn't say where he was going, only that he had a tailor to find, one whose work doesn't appear in storefronts. By dusk, he had not returned. I sat at his desk, rifling through the ledger again, and my eyes fell upon the list of fabrics found in Vale's shop. One entry caught my eye: Hessian twill, dyed red and claimed, unclaimed, a coat meant for someone, but never collected, a garment left behind. I felt something tighten in my chest. That evening, as the light faded and I lit the lamps myself, I could not shake the feeling that our case had not truly ended. That somewhere in the city's sprawl, someone else waited behind a curtain, watching, measuring, biding their time. And as Holmes had often told me, the greatest trick is not hiding the answer, it's making people believe the question has already Being asked Dot as the fire dwindled to embers, I looked toward the door and waited.